All right, well, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. I think my goal, typically speaking, is to try to keep these conversations to about 30 minutes or so. Ultimately, trying to overwhelm you guys with as many best practices and insights and emerging trends that we see across our portfolio in a pretty condensed format. So I think how I measure success in these types of conversations is if there's one, maybe two small takeaways that you can take and apply to your programs overnight with or without Reviewr. I think that would be a win for all parties here involved today. Of course, with that said, everything that we're going to review and kind of discuss is certainly made easier by using a platform like Reviewr to help you kind of power your programming from literally start to finish. I'll kind of get into an introduction of what we do and kind of our background here in just a quick second. So for those that are interested in kind of diving deeper into Reviewr, exploring some of these topics or these conversations, or who are interested in learning more about the platform in itself and how it might work for your programs, I am going to drop a quick link into the chat. It's a direct calendar link to my calendar, and we can spend some time kind of digesting and diving deeper into your unique programs and how that maps directly to Reviewr. So, with all that said, kind of a little switch up for you guys here today. We initially had intended on hosting a similar conversation for two different demographics. One was supposed to be for scholarship season without the spreadsheet scramble, the other for grant making without the spreadsheet scramble. That's what we get for trying to use a play on words. That makes me stutter. With that said, looking at the signups that we have here today, we have a large number of organizations who are doing both scholarships and or grants. And so I thought it might be more beneficial to all of our time to kind of touch on both topics in one. We'll kind of jump around to a couple different examples. At the end of the day, though, from a pure workflow perspective, like there is no difference. Let's go and kind of get into our background and our introduction. So why we're having today's conversation, kind of where we come from. So we're very fortunate at Reviewr to work with thousands of organizations doing a lot of different use cases, not just scholarships and grants. It could be award programs, it could be board nominations, volunteer committee apps, fellowships, conference speakers, proposals. That list goes on and on. Any type of program that requires like an intake of an application process, and then more specifically, a built-in like review selection scoring engine as well. And so, like I said, we work with thousands of organizations, foundations, nonprofits, membership-based associations, government institutions, for-profit entities, both their foundation arm as well as their HR departments, doing these types of campaigns. And the reason why I bring that up is number one, we actually have a background coming from the space. So we named the company Reviewr because our team has a deep background in review, purely from a volunteer perspective in funding opportunities. So we actually live that very paper-based binder life where we'd have application proposals sent to us via the mail. We'd handwrite notes and scores and feedback. We'd mail it back. We'd meet in person. We'd kind of hash out the details. We also live kind of that online transformation, which really is what spurs today's conversation, which turned out to be a lot of built-in web forms, emails, downloading of documents, packaging things up in spreadsheets. And from a pure volunteer perspective, what we found is that we were actually spending probably 4x the time that we actually were via paper, believe it or not. But more, I guess, problematic was the impact that that had on the applicants themselves. And so, in many organizations and instances, in a small community, we knew who the applicants were. So, what should have been a very fair, thoughtful review of their content turned more so into popularity contests, who knew whom, and it wasn't fair to the applicants. The other piece of the puzzle, again, while we're chatting today, is with enough downloading and exporting and recompiling and work within a spreadsheet, it's not unheard of for information to get lost, misplaced, formulas to break, rows to be misaligned. And there were use cases that we had heard where, entire review cycles were conducted and applicants were completely excluded. So we built Reviewr as an online platform to kind of run both scholarships and grants, the full life cycle end to end from start to finish, everything from submission through decision. While we're chatting today is one of the most common things that we hear as we kind of dive deeper into our work with other organizations of like, where does your time go? What does a day in life look like? Is it almost always results in some type of work within spreadsheets, right? There are so many moving parts to scholarships and grants. You've got the submission experience, which is applications, files, communication back and forth. There's the judging and scoring process. And then ultimately, there's the entire post-selection workflows of, impact reporting from grantees. It could be scholarship acceptance packets, proof of enrollment, multi-year renewals of both scholarships and grants. And so at any of these stages, right, unless you're using Reviewr, but even then, we still find some clients are still using spreadsheets because their team prefers to operate offline. There's some type of work being done within a spreadsheet, and that becomes very problematic for a lot of different reasons. So what I wanted to do today, and again, making some assumptions that you guys are here because you signed up because you are living within spreadsheets, is to kind of map like what the light looks like at the other end of the tunnel. For us, it's not just like a single moment or a single use case that powers you guys having to export, download, and go offline for the more manual work of these programs. It's a compounding effect of multiple things not being completely interconnected. Applications coming in one way, having to do judging and scoring another way, communicating another way. And so, in order for us to really solve this challenge, we really do need to look at our programs holistically speaking from an end-to-end perspective. We're not dealing with grant or scholarship applications. We're dealing with people and organizations. We're not dealing with a bunch of random documentation and deliverables. We're dealing with their submission packet and their quote-unquote profile. On the review side, we're not asking people to go look at elements of an entry. What we're actually doing is asking them to kind of build a comprehensive snapshot or persona around that applicant that they can then leverage to go through a very thoughtful, deliberate review and selection process, used in conjunction with comparisons to other candidates. How do we kind of build the best case per person to make sure that your funding is going to the right people? And then long term is how do we kind of create this ecosystem where the recipients, again, scholars or grantees, can kind of come back and engage with the online, intuitive, modern experience to continue their follow-ups and continue their journey. Again, it could be early on, which would be like acceptance packets, fund disbursement forms, scholarship and grant agreements, proof of enrollment, to more long-term thinking, which would be like your follow-up testimonials and your impact reports, helping you guys measure the ROI that your programs are having on the communities and of the demographic that you're trying to solve. And so for me, again, I like to go kind of piece by piece. I don't want to make this a very kind of text-driven presentation. That's why by design, what I'm looking at here on my screen is quite basic and quite minimal. I want to help better visualize these concepts for you in Reviewr. Now, again, you're going to get a kind of a snapshot or a kind of a preview of what Reviewr looks like. That's not my intention today. My intention is to help you better visualize these concepts and these workflows that you can then take and apply to your programs. So, with all that said, the first kind of item I want to look at today is the intake process. And I think for a lot of organizations, when they hear that term, they think of the online submission. And that's partially true. But at the end of the day, intake happens multiple different times from different types of people at different stages within a program. So, what's very common for a lot of organizations is on the very front end, when they develop an online or a submission experience, again, scholarships or grants, is to either build out online web forms. So you're using like your relatively free or cheap online form tools. So your Survey Monkeys, your Google Forms, your Jot Forms, things like that. You may be asking applicants to go to your website, download a fillable PDF or Word doc, kind of work on it offline, then package it back up. Those are two very different processes, clearly. We'll kind of get into maybe where we can help you guys on that front. But these are very one-dimensional, right? It's an intake process. It's an online form. It's one-dimensional to collect data. What it doesn't do is kind of re-aggregate everything back into one centralized hub. And because of that, where I think you spend a lot of your time and energy is as these applications come in, even looking at tools like Google Forms or Job Forms, you still need to go to those platforms, download and export all of the submissions to make sense of it, right? You have to repackage it back up, make sense of it, make it more user friendly for it to get into the hands of the review team. On the more manual process, so fillable of PDFs or Word documents that get emailed into you, first and foremost, we have to hope we don't miss anybody. And then once we do get everybody, it becomes much more manual to have to recompile them into like these virtual packets for the team. On top of that, we have to look at all the deliverables that make up a profile, right? And it's going to look different by program. You've got file uploads, so transcripts, resumes, budgets, grant agreements, project proposals. Could be multi-stage. It could be an LOI versus a full application. So we have the actual intake process. We've got the content included in the intake process. We have the recompiling of all this information because our team ultimately needs it for review and scoring. And we start to layer on some of the other complexities behind the scenes, right? Maybe you have letters of recommendation. If that's the case, how do those get submitted? Are they submitted by the applicant themselves? That in itself is problematic because more times than not, it's private. We don't want applicants to see it. So in that case, if we want the references to submit it to us directly, how do we do that? Well, you don't want them to submit it to you via email or attachments because now you're left trying to figure out who is this, who does it belong to, how do we recompile it back together? And then the last piece to the puzzle is the ongoing intake. So again, intake doesn't end at submission. For most of you, once you make a selection, those individuals who are recipients, scholars or grantees, we want them to come back for future engagements with us, acceptance packets, ROI reports, things of that nature. And so the reason why I kind of gave you that long-winded introduction is I think it's really important for all of us on the call here today to really look at like what goes into the applicant experience. And that term there that we want to emphasize is the experience. And look at it from the perspective of there's, 6 to 8 moving parts or steps that are all happening at different times. At the end of the day, all of these need to funnel back into a centralized hub. The next thing I want to look at before I actually visualize this for you is before a human even touches the applications. So many of the organizations that we work with have some type of raw eligibility criteria or requirements. And it creates two tremendous headaches for everybody involved. Number one is even if you just have one program, so one scholarship or one grant, if there are requirements, generally speaking, not everybody's going to be eligible, right? Seems like a silly thing to say, but depending on your pipeline and your volume, I don't want to waste any applicant's time applying for an opportunity that they're not eligible for. Yes, it's unfortunate for them to waste their time, but it's also a bad look and reflection of you guys as an organization. Number two is if you are a larger volume organization, you're spending a whole heck of a lot of your time before you even review the merits of their content, just trying to figure out who we should focus on based off of eligibility. So how do we not waste their time? How do we help you spend your time more efficiently? And then what I really want to emphasize here is for those that have maybe multiple opportunities, so multiple scholarships and multiple grants. Each one of them may have its own unique eligibility and its own requirements. And I don't want to just help us track eligibility, so unlocking those forms. What I really want to do is help align them to the appropriate opportunity. So to kind of give you an example, this is going to be for a scholarship. There's a school foundation that we work with that has well north of 100 different scholarships. And I understand that that might be like a really extreme example, 100 different endowments. What a nice problem to have. The challenge with that is so many of them are hyper specialized and hyper focused. So, for example, there's one where they literally are only looking for people who are high school seniors who went to a very certain school who are going to be pursuing post graduation athletics, right? They're going to become a student athlete. And so the challenge with that is A, how do we again track the eligibility? And then two is with this many programs that are going on, without a doubt, there are qualified, eligible potential scholars or grantees, if that's your case, who are eligible for that opportunity that have no idea that it even exists. So that endowment is going under applied for, it's going under touched. And from an applicant's perspective, there's money there waiting for them that they're actually deeply aligned to that they have no idea even is there. So how do we leverage the understanding we have on an applicant to not just track eligibility, but actually route them to the appropriate opportunities themselves? So to help you visualize that, again, this is a scholarship example. I want to just continue to reiterate that the scholarship logo and the form content that we're going to look at is completely irrelevant. Every one of these concepts is going to be the exact same for both scholarship providers and for grant makers. The idea, however, though, is to kind of shift our mindsets away from online forms. What we really do, again, is to position the applicant experience as a profile or as an online portal. So generally, we'll work with your website. So you've got strong content, strong branding. We should leverage that. From there, applicants come in. They tell us who they are. This in itself is the beginning of their profile. So everything moving forward is going to be completely configurable by scholarship, by grant, by sub scholarships, by sub grants. So again, this is simply just an example. The idea, however, though, again, as you can see, is it's very different than the traditional online applications. Visually speaking, yes, it's still a form that they're filling out. Behind the scenes, however, applicants can save, they can log out, they can come back later, mobile responsive, it's ADA compliant. Kind of a little teaser here, just to kind of jump ahead is that all of our clients get these operational dashboards. This is going to show you in real time dates and deadlines, recent activity, and where are applicants in their journey. So for anybody right now using anything besides Reviewr, Jotform, Google Forms, PDFs, Word documents, you have no visibility into what's happening until somebody actually applies. In this example, I can actually show you in real time not only what your dates and deadlines are, but how many people have started, how many people have finished, how many people are in progress. Those that are in progress, we can identify them. We can see how far they made it. We can send automated reminder messages. If you are going to be leveraging Reviewr for references, which we will come back to, you can see how many outstanding references requests that we're waiting on, the status of those, send reminders to them. And then again, looking long term, since it is profile centric, If you take a handful of recipients and move them to a new workflow called grant reporting or scholarship acceptance packet, not only will we collect that within the system, but again, you can track who's in that stage. Have they done those tasks or deliverables or not? If not, you can automate reminders to them as well. So jumping back to the application form, again, I don't want to get deep into the weeds on the forms. Again, it's not rocket science here. What I do want to visualize though is that built-in eligibility check. So for a lot of organizations, applicants come in, they tell us some basic information about who they are, and then we do want to layer on your eligibility. So this is a pretty simple, basic example by design. It's more so yeses and nos. You can make this far more complex and far more robust. But what we want to do is basically take all of your programs. If it's one, that's fine. If it's 101, it's fine. And for each one of them, look at like what are the eligibility criteria. And then from there, you can do one of two things. You can ask them to pick what scholarship or what grant they're applying for. Based on the response, we can then serve up the eligibility questions. At that point, we can either say, yes, you can proceed, or no, you can't. Or in this example, because this client does multiple different programs, the system will then kind of audit and build a persona around their information. So based on what they tell us here, we can then say, hey, of the 32 different grants or of the 12 different scholarships, these are the three that you're actually eligible for. Now, of those three, which of or all of them do you want to apply for? That in itself is another really critical piece to the puzzle because, again, two things are happening. One is that we're helping them identify opportunities that they are eligible for. Number two is that they can apply to multiple at the same time. So you might have a shared application. Most of you probably, though, have unique questions per program. And so if I choose both the Brooke Marlowe Scholarship and the Jasper Rye, there's going to be some information that's consistent across both. The system will pre-fill that. That way we're not asking applicants to redundantly enter their information. But number two is that it's then going to serve up like what is the very unique essay prompt or the very unique upload that the Brooke Marlowe Scholarship is requesting. So applicant makes their selection. The system then intelligently updates and says, great, we now know this is your path. Therefore, these are the questions that you fill out. And on the back end, we're going to start to categorize them as such. So at this point, applicant kind of progresses on with their journey. Again, a couple other small items here. Not only can they save and log out, they can upload virtually any type of file, any file size, any file type. Kind of keeps your team hyper focused and no limitations on that perspective. Briefly, the other thing I want to look at are those references. So this isn't part of today's conversation, but I do want to kind of just offer this as kind of a little bonus. More times than not, organizations who are doing letters of recommendation have moved out of that model. Again, I've already touched on this, but letters are personal. More times than not, the person writing it does not want the applicant to see it. With that said, you also don't want them to send it to you directly. So what do? In this example, the applicant actually puts in the name and email of who is writing that letter of support or that letter. It then fires off a notification saying, hey, Susie, you've been asked to write a reference on behalf of Kyle. Click here to do so. And then it brings that person, and again, this could be used for things besides references. It could be letters of support. It could be third-party individuals assisting with the application process if it's a grant. But the idea is it brings them into a dedicated place to add their content. Now, I know what you're thinking. This does not look like a reference letter upload. You're absolutely correct. I also don't love visually how this one looks, so I'm gonna kind of steer you guys in a different direction. We have seen a big trend moving away from letters for multiple different reasons. People don't have time, right? So it's a pretty heavy ask to ask people to sit down from scratch, write a full-on letter. Two is they often reuse previously written letters. And three, a lot of times people will just go to Chat GPT and say, hey, write me a reference on behalf of so-and-so, and they just copy and paste it back in. So what we like to see happening at Reviewr is to potentially you can still do reference letter uploads. I'm not saying you can't do that, but instead create these templates. I don't love the 1 through 10 grading scale. What I would probably recommend is ask the references to answer maybe two or three very short questions. It's almost like a mini essay for them that mimics what you want to see in a reference, but instead of saying, hey, go structure this from scratch, the reference simply comes in, they see question, they answer question, and then they submit. Now, the beauty of all this, and this is the last thing I'll touch on here, is the profiles themselves. So instead of you guys having to go to your inbox and download a bunch of stuff or go to Jotform or Google Forms and start to export them out into spreadsheets, what you now get is this built-in menu system. And this is a list, right, of all of the participants that have applied. You can sort, you can filter, you can find. And then once you click into somebody's name or ID, what this is going to do is show you all the information that we just aggregated for you. So instead of being Michael as a row in a spreadsheet with each column being his or her data, we now have this virtual presence about them. So we've got their entire submission form, we have all their file uploads, we can communicate with them directly. If I jump up to our file uploads here at the top, it'll actually take all the documents and store them together. You guys can then press view. It actually embeds the file directly in front of us. That way your team never has to leave the system. Same thing goes with those references. What this really does, though, is it sets the stage for the next thing I want to look at, which is the review and selection. So the next topic here today, bullet number 3, is the review and a selection process. And there's two pieces to this. There's actually building out the review and selection workflow. And then the next slide that we're going to look at is the actual judging and scoring process. So very similar. I'm going to kind of address both of them really quickly, and then I'm going to visually show that to you. So on the review side, before you can even start to evaluate the applications you've received, we first need to kind of think through from an ideology perspective, how do we even want them to be scored? I'm going to leave you guys with two numbers. Do with it what you want. We at Reviewr have analyzed a lot of data. I'm talking in the, upwards of over 1 million entries to kind of figure out like what are some of the trends. And two things that we've identified. Number one is that volunteer fatigue is a real thing. What that means is that when a person comes in to review an application, their fatigue will set in around 30 to 40 submissions. What that means is that they're looking at more than 30 to 40 submissions. Not only are they wasting time that they don't have, but has a direct impact on the applicants. Submissions 30 through 60 actually get scored on a completely different scale than the first 10 submissions that they reviewed. Again, that's a true statement. We have the data. Even though you're using structured scorecards and rubrics, hopefully that's true. Okay, so we know that that's the case. We know that on average, our committees really shouldn't be looking at more than 40. On the flip side, we know for a fact that each submission should be reviewed between 3 to 5 times. Anything less than 3 does not give our team enough ammo or data to make an informed decision. Anything more than 5 becomes a law of diminishing return. 5 reviews versus 35 reviews, that applicant's actual score and average doesn't really change a whole lot. So those are two really critical numbers because now that we know that, we can start to look internally at our own programs and figure out how do we want to structure our reviews. Most organizations, unless you're rather large volume, will basically say, hey, all applications come in, they all go to the review committee, they review them, we average them out, those are the results. And in that case, if they are looking at more than 40 submissions, there's problems there. So what you can consider doing is a couple different things. You can look at your programs. Maybe you offer 5 different scholarships. The most low-hanging thing you can do is create review teams or committees by award or by scholarship or by grant, right? So if I applied to the Jasper Rye grant, right, this might go to these 3 evaluators. If they apply to the Susie Marlowe scholarship, it goes to these 5 reviewers. You also could consider layering on phases of review. So if you're a grant making organization, maybe you start with an LOI. In that example, your team can actually score more than 40 submissions because what you're looking at is much more condensed. From there, you narrow that pool down, you invite them back, they fill out the full proposal. And then in that review, it's a smaller subset where your team can actually review more comprehensively, but also look at less entries. The other thing you could consider doing, if you do want your entire team to review all the applicants, is to do random assignments. You could say, hey, I'm going to trust what Kyle says. He's got 1 million+ applicants of data. He thinks he knows what he's talking about. Let's just set it and forget it. Let's make sure that every applicant gets reviewed maybe 5 times, or each reviewer scores no more than 40. And then the system will then equally and randomly kind of disperse those submissions across your staff and across your team. So we'll look at some of that. You might be thinking to yourself, well, this sounds great and all, but I don't have the capacity to add more staff or more volunteers to help with the review. So in that example, this next slide becomes incredibly valuable because what we're actually going to be looking at here is how do we create a very efficient review scoring model where the team in theory could still review more than 40, but not have volunteer fatigue set in. That also may mean let's leverage maybe some AI concepts as well to help with some pre-ranking, some pre-scoring, and summarizing of content. So before I show this to you, on the review and selection side, there's a couple kind of challenges that we often see. Number one is that there is no formal review. It's very subjective, right? So a team gets together, they read through the application packets. It turns very emotional. I like this one. I don't like this one. I have a relationship with this one, right? So I want them to be selected. And that becomes very problematic for many different reasons, right? I don't have to go deep into the weeds. The other example that would be organizations that do use a structured scorecard or a rubric, but they make it far too complex. They're asking them to score, 15 to 20 questions. Each question's on a scale from 1 to 20. What ends up happening in that example is, how do you differentiate a 16 versus a 17? Seems like a really small thing, but that evaluator who doesn't even know how to answer that question, 16 versus 17, will deviate, right? So what maybe started as a 14 is now becoming 17s. And when you start to get large enough volume, it actually does move the needle. You also start to run into the issue of the order in which that they review. So as an evaluator, I typically speaking work down a list top to bottom and then left to right. So if I and Susie are both given 20 submissions to review, you might be thinking, great, we're well within that threshold. That's true. However, that 20th candidate is the same 20th for both me and Susie. What that means is that by the time we get to them, some level of fatigue has set in, and we're now comparing that candidate to the 19 people above them. That in itself is also a problem because we looked at the data and that applicant scored last is also being scored on a different scale. So what do? You shuffle it. So those are a couple different examples. The other thing I do want to kind of touch on too, and I'll kind of move on to the next slide, is yeah, I'll come back to this because we'll come back. So what does that look like? So in a more defined environment, what you'll be able to do, at least in a tool like Reviewr, is build out these review workflows. The concept here to kind of stick with you is a concept called bucketing. And it does three very important things. It'll categorize your submissions. So if you are offering multiple scholarships and or multiple grants, you basically create a bucket for each one of them. The system then has logic that says, hey, Kyle applied to the Lennox Wilder scholarship. Therefore, let's drop his or her submission into that grouping. Another example is if you have multiple phases, it serves as a progression system. So you might have the Lennox Wilder scholarship, and you might have phase one review, phase two review. Maybe you're a grant maker, you have an LOI bucket where all applications flow into, you review them, you advance them then to phase two, which is the full proposal. Why this works really well is not only are we kind of creating better structure and tracking around your entries, we're also now laying the framework to create review workflows. So what I can do here is I can say, hey, the LOI stage is going to be reviewed by Sally, Sue, and Steve. However, once people move on to the full proposal stage, Cindy, Tony, and Paul are coming in. So this goes back to what I mentioned earlier on. We're not saying, hey, go review everybody. We're creating little mini committees or teams in charge of a subset of your entries. What you can also do with this information, at least within Reviewr, you can probably do this with AI as well as spreadsheets. I'm sorry, within randomizers, is to do a random assignment. So if I open these workflows up, it'll actually show me how many submissions we've received, who they are, and who from my team in theory could review them. So if you want to use my math, you could literally come into the system and say, let's auto assign each applicant between 3 to 5 evaluators, or maybe you want to set a very firm number of each person gets reviewed 5 times. The system will then take your submissions, it'll look at who your review team is, it'll do an equal random distribution, and then from there, you can always override it. So you could say, well, we have a conflict of interest or somebody dropped out. You can just edit the assignments and then reassign them back out. So this is a really powerful page. I'm going to stop there for this. That again helps you go from submission to review group pairing. Again, there's a million and one ways that you can do that. What I want to emphasize now, though, is the actual review. So again, traditionally speaking, if you're part of a review committee, you're often getting a bunch of emails with attachments. You're going to Google Drive, downloading folders. You're going to whatever the SharePoint or file sharing systems, and you're basically now offline trying to look at all the content. And then you go to a spreadsheet, log your comments, log your notes, log your scores, send it back to you guys. And then you have to basically recompile all that and run your formulas. In Reviewr, the review team comes into a centralized hub. The system will actually show them in real time dates and deadlines, how many submissions are assigned to them, how much time is remaining. And then at that point, they can simply open their queue. This will then show them a list, in this case, of 4 entries that I'm in charge of looking at. These are, for the sake of this example, grant applications. The evaluator can then simply click on the name of the grantee. They're then given a split screen. So half the page is that quote unquote applicant packet. So no more downloading, no more exporting, no more opening it up in new tabs or new pieces of paper. And then the other half of the page is your selection tool. So again, that in itself is completely custom built to address that 1 through 20 scale that I mentioned beforehand. Sure, you could still do that. Most of our clients nowadays will have like a 1 through 5, 1 through 10, or what I'm kind of partial to is they ask for an emotional response. So instead of rating the clarity of the proposal from 1 to 20, it's basically does not meet expectations or exceeds expectations. Behind the scenes, each one of those prompts has a numerical value associated with it, so you can still leverage data-driven decision making. However, it speeds up the review time, right? And it seems like a small thing, but if you can shave off 2 to 3 minutes per submission with 25 submission, we're talking hours of time across your team. The second thing it does is an emotional response is typically a higher quality response. So the review team simply comes in. Everything that they need to review is on one side of the page. That's a combination of the submission form. Also, could be the file uploads that get embedded within here. And then they can start to fill out the scorecards. I'm going to touch on this really briefly just because I don't want to go too long here today. For those of you that don't have the fortunate luxury of having infinite staff sizes, you might be saying, okay, well, my team still needs to read 75 submissions apiece. Great. What you can then do in that example is think to yourself, do I really need the committee to review the entire submission? What I mean by that is a lot of times these applications are heavy. There's multiple file uploads, there's long form content. And in reality, in a phase one review, what you really want to know is, does this candidate align with what we're looking for, yes or no? And then all the yeses get a much deeper review. So what you could do is you could actually enable some of the AI tools, and you can convert that application to a smart summary, or what I call like a one-page review brief. This basically pulls forward all the really critical information, gives you like a one-page summary of the candidate. And for a lot of organizations, this serves as a very good first phase for review. So instead of reading 3 different file uploads in 32 form fields, they're reading a one pager. They rank it, they score it. You have a total number of submissions. Some are clear consensuses that move on, some are clear consensuses that don't. And then maybe there's a gray area. That gray area can get a deeper review. Now, what you've actually done is you can then take the people who move on to the consensus, move them to phase two, and then very similarly, you'll still use scorecards. However, you can now have them go to a much deeper audit of file uploads, form fields, etc. The difference is that instead of looking at 75 submissions, you're looking at 20. We're now within that norm of the ratio from submitter to reviewer. So I'll kind of just pause there. There's other kind of AI tools built in as well. So great, what happens next? So once these submissions are scored, it then funnels into a centralized leaderboard for you and your team. So what does that mean? What does that look like? And also, why is that important? So if I kind of jump back over to our presentation, one of the last things that we're going to look at, I guess I kind of already skipped over it, is the decision-making process. So we do want to leverage data for data-driven decisions, where we don't want to have like a loose he say, she say, this one feels like a good candidate, this one doesn't. We want to pull the scores. We want to kind of leverage the data. With that said, we definitely want to have deliberation meetings. There could be a really compelling case why one applicant should be selected, not another one. And so the idea is to basically do two things. One is that once the results come in, don't be shy. Pre-share to your committees the results. You can redact it, right? So you can make it very anonymous, but give them some insights into who was scored and how they were scored the way that they were. What you can then do is have them come to your deliberation meetings prepared. And you can pull a page like this that basically says, by program, here's all the applicants, here's the team or committee that reviewed it, here's their individual scores, here's their total scores. And then ultimately, you can then start to use this data to make decisions. Either you're going to start to flag people that move on to phase one to phase two. You can actually make decisions from here, right? So you can award them or select them, or your team can actually have a very insightful deliberation meeting. And who knows, in this example, maybe there's a really compelling case why Richard actually gets selected opposed to maybe Sheldon. I'm not going to show this for the sake of time. I did actually introduce to everybody here on the call one big issue, and that issue is with randomization. So I mentioned it'd be great, right, if every applicant was reviewed 5 times, no more, no less. What that means, though, in a good way, is that the review team did not read every single submission. Great, they spent less time. What's not great about that is your team has personal tendencies. And so if I, as Kyle, routinely give out a score of a 10, but Susie routinely gives out a score of a 30, we're now leaving the applicant's fate in the hands of who they were assigned to. They were assigned to me, they're at a 20-point disadvantage. They're never going to be selected. When in reality, my 10 versus Susie's 30 actually isn't 20 points apart. It's the exact same score. It's my average and her average. So Reviewr actually has some built-in tools as well to help you identify the individual tendencies of your committees, and it normalizes the results for you. Instead of comparing me to Susie, what it really does is it looks at who I reviewed, and then it compares those applicants against my own tendencies to figure out, did I score them higher or lower than my own personal average? And that new metric is then what can be averaged again against the broader review pool. So the last thing I want to look at here today, and I'm going to open this up for a question and answer, is the post-awarding process. So a lot of organizations will use a tool, even Reviewr, right? And they go through from submission to decision. Then what happens next? Well, we need our recipients to come back and do a fund disbursement form. They have to do a grant acceptance packet. We want them to come back and do a proof of enrollment. Grantees need to come back and do a 6 month and 1 year progress report, and they get comfortable with that and it moves offline, right? They send emails to the applicant saying, hey, it's been 6 months. We need your impact report. Or, hey, scholar, here's the information about your scholarship. Now send to us the address of where the check's going to go and your proof of enrollment. And now that information lives within an email inbox, right? You're waiting on it, you're losing it, you're having to download it, export it, recompile it. There's no visibility. So at least within Reviewr, what you're able to do is you can create these review workflows. So again, you can then take all of your recipients, move them to a post-recipient stage. Within that stage, we can then define tasks such as I want you to do a 6 month report and a 1 year report, or I want you to do an acceptance packet and then a proof of enrollment. What ends up happening though is instead of them having to go through email and send it to you, it'll notify them. It brings them right to that task, either directly as a link, or if they came back into Reviewr, they can jump into their portal. They can click add, pick the task assigned to them, and then they fill it out directly within the system. So what's great about this is that number one is that we're now tracking them. So we know who's in this stage. We know if they've done it or not. We can send reminders. Two, they're filling this out directly within Reviewr. So again, this is a grant reporting template, but this could be whatever your deliverables are. Number three is once this gets submitted, that information gets sent back to their profile. So what started with them telling us eligibility has now grown into their initial eligibility, their submission form, their file uploads, communication, the results of however many phases of review you have, plus this new section called supplemental deliverables, which are all these ongoing tasks or forms or file uploads that they're sending to you. So it kind of packages everything up for you. It also makes ongoing reporting, such as impact reporting, substantially easier. So with all that said, hopefully I didn't go too long here today. My goal is again to kind of overwhelm you guys with as many insights and best practices as I can. Again, if any of you walk away today with one small thing that you might want to incorporate into your program, normalizing the judging tendencies, the shuffle list for the review team, the random review order, eligibility, any of those things, I would mark today's conversation as a win. I'm going to hang out for as long as you guys want. So any questions you might have about today's topic, about review, or about challenges that you might be running into on a completely different topic, again, toss them in the chat and we'll hang out answering them for as long as you guys want. Okay, getting pretty quiet. So again, I did drop my calendar link into the chat to start the conversation. Anybody wants to explore Reviewr deeper, go ahead, use that, find a time. I would love to have those conversations. For everybody else, I did obviously record this. We will be sending over a recap, article version, video version. Keep an eye out for that follow-up resource. Share that with anybody else you'd like. And as always, if there's anything else I can ever do for you, any other questions, please never be a stranger. Thanks so much. I appreciate your time today.